Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know the English set up praying towns, which were created specifically to try to forcefully anglicize Native Americans by cutting off their hair and dressing them in European clothing? At one point, during King Philip's War, the English rounded up innocent natives and dumped them on a remote island to all starve to death. That the beginning of the war was so terrorizing to the English, some even sailed back to England. And in the end, King Philip's head was placed on a spike and displayed in Plymouth for the next 20 years. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will learn about that and more in episode 16, King Philip's War. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I'd like to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last week, we discussed various aspects of New England society and covered the first major conflict between the English and the natives, the Pequot War. This week, we're going to fast forward just a little bit, about 40 years, to the 1670s and the conflict that is known in the United States as King Philip's War. King Philip's War, beginning in 1675 and ending in 1676, is incredibly important when examining the history of the New England colonies. Probably more than any other major conflict in the U.S., King Philip's War is often ignored, overlooked, and even at times undervalued. And as you're listening to this, you might be thinking that you don't even remember learning about it. And you may not have. But King Philip's War was incredibly important and will lead to long-lasting effects in the New England area. The expulsion of the Pequots in the 1630s, which we covered last week, led to a lot of available land for the English colonists, and there was little dispute between the English colonies and the natives for the next 20 to 30 years. But by the 1670s, the westward expansion of these New England colonists once again created seemingly unavoidable conflict with the Native Americans. See, not much of the New England land was actually good for farming, and as younger generations grew up in New England, land was becoming more and more valuable. And at the same time, it was becoming more and more scarce. Many Native American tribes grew frustrated by the growing English population, but for the most part, tensions, at least up to this point, had not boiled over. King Philip's War, ironically, saw the English come into conflict with their oldest ally, the Wampanoag tribe. Recognize that name? If you remember, the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 and held their first Thanksgiving feast in 1621. It was Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe who welcomed them and helped them to survive. Now, what must be understood is that at that time, the English seemed like little threat, and at least to Massasoit and the Wampanoag, it made sense to have them as valuable allies against the Narragansett. But with new generations of English being born and raised in the colonies, the need for native alliances dissipated, and the relationship between the English and the Wampanoag suffered in turn. In 1646, so about 10 years after the Pequot War, the English began to establish praying towns along the borderlands of English and native areas. These praying towns were set up to convert and, in effect, control Native Americans. Natives had to give up their dress, they had to cut their hair, and basically reject every aspect of their native culture while openly accepting English culture and the Anglican faith. The blended cultures that these praying towns created caused understandable resentment by some of the Native Americans who wanted to be sure to maintain Native identity and sovereignty while still having a beneficial political and economic relationship with the English. In 1662, the second son of Massasoit, a native named Metacom, became Sachem, or chief of the Wampanoag tribe. Metacom, who had been known to the English as Philip for the last couple years, took over the Wampanoags after his brother Alexander passed away, with some Wampanoags actually believing he was poisoned by the English. And for you world history nerds out there, it wasn't an accident that they were named after the great kings of Macedonia, Philip II and his son Alexander the Great. Anyways, King Philip, at the young age of 24 years old, inherited control of a tribe that truly was at a crossroads, because by all accounts, King Philip was a good leader who had grown up in both native and English culture, and King Philip had close personal relationships with many Englishmen, which is what makes this war so surprising. But Philip had no desire to wholly adapt to English culture, once saying, quote, "If I became a praying sachem, I shall be a poor and weak one, and trod upon by others." The retention of Wampanoag sovereignty was a priority for Philip, and this is what would eventually lead to conflict. The expansion of the English angered the Native Americans, and the farming practices of the English infuriated them. The English would allow their cattle to roam wherever they wanted, especially the pigs. And while this doesn't seem like that big of a deal, it was a very big deal. This was a serious issue for the natives because these animals would not only eat native food, but also eat the food of the animals that the natives were hunting. After unsuccessfully trying to place a moratorium on land sales, Philip decided that he had to change course. The Wampanoags were desperate and in an increasingly vulnerable position in their relationship with the English. In 1671, and remember this encounter as we move forward, 4 years prior to the outbreak of war, the English heard rumors that Philip was potentially negotiating an alliance with the Dutch or the French or other native tribes. They weren't really sure, but that's not what was important. What was important is that there could not be an armed conflict, and the English wanted to step in to make sure this did not happen. Colonial leaders met with Philip, demanded he disarm, pay a fine, and sign a confession, admitting that he was being disloyal. For all intents and purposes, this meeting signified the power structure in this English-native relationship. The Wampanoags, who had likely realized this before, but now it's being confirmed, were not being treated like equal partners, but instead like junior partners. But recognizing the conflict with the English would only destroy the Wampanoag land and endanger many of his people, Philip decided in 1671 to show restraint and try to live peacefully amongst the English. But this uneasy peace would unravel 4 years later in 1675. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. Hey class, I just want to let you know that if you'd like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to reach out. You can find us on Twitter with the handle @ATeachersHist, on Facebook at A Teacher's History Podcast, or email me, chris@ateachershistory.com. And if you have a minute, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a rating on iTunes or wherever you access this podcast. All right, now let's get back to the outbreak of King Philip's War. As we begin to talk about the conflict that is known as King Philip's War, there's one man who's very important that you need to know about, and his name is John Sassaman. He was a native who had converted to Christianity, and he served as a mediator between the English and the Wampanoag tribe in the 1670s. He gathered information that Philip and the Wampanoags were planning an attack on the English. Sassaman traveled to Plymouth to warn the English, and curiously was found dead 3 weeks later. As you can see, the English were not only angry, but highly suspicious. Still today, no one knows how he died, but I'm sure you can see why this is likely going to cause a problem. 3 Native Americans, including one very close advisor to Philip, were brought in for trial of the English court, unsurprisingly found guilty, and hanged on June 8th. Naturally, Philip and his warriors were furious. They believed that an alleged murder of a Native American by Native Americans should have been handled internally by, Native Americans. To them, this was a clear infringement upon their sovereignty and was not acceptable. No doubt, feeling very significant pressure from many of his warriors, King Philip began to prepare for war. Now, for the past few years, Philip had been selling much of the native land to the English, using this money to rearm from the Dutch and the French in anticipation of an eventual conflict. Because remember, 4 years prior, in 1671, the English made him give up all of his arms. So, on June 20th, 1675, war breaks out with the first major attack taking place in Swansea, Massachusetts, killing 10 people. After the fighting officially broke out and it was clear that a significant war was going to take place, Native American tribes from Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and even present-day Maine became involved in the fight, with many of them seeing this as a last-ditch effort to finally stop the seemingly never-ending white expansion in New England. In response to the initial violence, the English became both fearful and distrustful of all Native Americans and, in a panic, rounded up hundreds of peaceful, Christianized natives in the middle of winter, put them on boats, and dumped them all in Deer Island, which is located in the middle of the Boston Harbor. With no food, no extra clothing, no supplies to build a shelter, in essence, sentencing all of them to death, which they did suffer. Men, women, and children. By the winter of 1675 and 76, it was clear that the Native Americans had the upper hand in this war, attacking Plymouth and Providence in March of 76. By the late spring of 1676, the English had retreated to the outskirts of Boston, with some of them even jumping on ships to sail back to England. But this was the high point of the war for the natives. Over time, the advantages of the English prevailed. The English had better weapons, were far more numerous, and were able to negotiate alliances with other native tribes to finally turn the tide of war. In August of 1676, anticipating defeat, Philip retreated back to Mount Hope to live his final days. On August 2nd, his wife and son were kidnapped, and on August 12th, Philip himself was killed. Not wanting to honor a traitor's body with a proper burial, the English were excessively brutal. Philip was beheaded, and his body drawn and quartered, with his head placed on a pike and put on a hill overlooking Plymouth for the next 20 years as a warning to other Native Americans. The rest of his body was hung from trees in the surrounding area, with his hand being given to Joseph Alderman, the man who fatally shot Philip, as a reward. Both Philip's wife and son were sold into slavery in Barbados, and the remaining native combatants were also either sold into slavery or executed. King Philip's War had far-reaching impacts on the New England colonies, and this is really important to keep in mind. This war included violence on a scale not seen before in New England, with many innocent women and children suffering death at the hands of both the natives and the English. This war was horrifying for the English people, with their cattle being killed, farms and homes being burned, and towns being totally destroyed. While the psychological toll was difficult for the English to overcome, the impact of this war on the local native tribes was insurmountable. King Philip's War was the last major war between the people of New England and the Native Americans, ending the power struggle once and for all between the English and the natives, and finally dismissing this notion that the English prioritized Christianizing the natives over land and money. Because land and money, in the end, were the motivating factors for war. And these two things will continue to be motivating factors for future English and native conflicts. Tensions remained high in New England, and many had trouble relieving their anxiety caused by King Philip's War. These lingering anxieties bring us to the Salem Witchcraft Trials of 1692. Salem was on the outskirts of New England settlement, and the constant threat of native attacks, or just the unknown land to the west, stoked flames of paranoia and fear. The people of Salem fell victim to witchcraft hysteria, with a group of young girls accusing older women of witchcraft. These initial accusations included only a few members of society, but before long, over 150 men and women were wrapped up in these accusations. In a shocking development, 19 members of Salem were executed for the crime of being a witch, and these accusations then spread to numerous other New England towns and villages. Next episode, Zach, Bill, and myself will dive deeper into these notorious events in Salem and examine their impact on U.S. history. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider the direction that the New England colonies will be taking in the near future. With the defeat of the Wampanoag and King Philip, the English will continue to expand westward, finding themselves to be an asset to England's burgeoning commercial empire. Unfortunately for the colonies, their relative political, social, and economic independence will conflict with the larger mercantilist goals of England. Massachusetts will have its charter revoked, becoming a royal colony of England. This dominion of New England will see periods of both strict and loose enforcement of both trade and business regulations, eventually leading to growing frustration for the Parliament. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Next week, as I mentioned, Zach, Bill, and I will be covering the Salem Witchcraft Trials in depth. And the more you learn about them, the more embarrassing you realize it really was. See you then.